Good morning. It's very nice to be here. Sue called me in the fall and wanted to know if I was going to be in town. And Sue, I'm going to switch this on document camera for just a minute. Hopefully. Yes. That will work. And I didn't have plans to be in town, but I wanted to come back and see my dear friend Ron Kramer. By the way, it was 1963 that we first met at the University of Delaware. Most of you weren't born at that time, but that also was the year, unfortunately, that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and so it is a year we remember, and we were on campus the Friday afternoon that happened, and so on. And I also wanted to see my dear friends George and Jerry Kuhn, and I wanted to see the Oakland Grizzlies play basketball, which I saw the other night, and we'll go to the girls' game this afternoon and see all the good faculty at Oakland University. This is a really special place. And though I left sort of physically in 2001 to go back to the East Coast, I've never lost my affection for this university and this department. It's a wonderful place, and you doctoral students are in absolutely the right place, no question about it. I'm going to begin just a little bit unconventionally this morning and tell you a story. Talking about comprehension is sort of like, in 2 hours, is like reading War and Peace in 2 hours. There's a lot of dynamics, and there's a lot of things we're going to have to move through fairly quickly, and we'll skip some things, of course. But I want to make some points about comprehension because it's been my interest now for a very long time. When I was 12 years old, or maybe 13, living on a farm in Delaware, I remember one cold spring morning following my father and grandfather into the woods. And they had gone into the woods to cut trees, hardwood, either oak or poplar, because they were going to cut them up into fence posts. And my father carried with him a saw about 7 feet long. You see it up here on the screen up at the top. And there's a handle on each end. Most farmers at that time didn't have chainsaws. They were dangerous and very heavy and expensive for the typical farmers. So you used a handsaw. And at 12 or 13, I thought I could do anything. And I was fairly strong as a farm kid. And my grandfather and my father were sawing this tree. And I said to my father, let me do it. I want to get on the other end. And after a while, after my pestering, he relented, and I got on the other end of that saw. And I hadn't sawed more than 5 or 10 seconds before I realized that this was really hard work. And I began to perspire, and the saw wasn't working the way it should have been working. And back to the laptop. And my father said something to me. Are we right here, Sue? Yeah. My father said something to me very calmly as we were sawing, and I realized I was in over my head. He said, pull it toward you, son, and I'll pull it back. And so I pulled it toward him. He pulled it back. I pulled it. And all of a sudden, the saw began to do what it was supposed to do. Very simple statement. Now, if you look at that, that's my dad. He's a wonderful man. He loved Ron Kramer, by the way, as a son. And what was this? A simple statement. It was a direction, wasn't it? Pull it toward you, son. I'll pull it back. I had learned something. Right? It was moderated. He didn't fuss at me. He didn't scold me. It was very calm. Okay. When did he do it? When I was in trouble. He didn't do it before. He didn't wait till afterwards and say to me, you know, if you just pulled it toward you and I'd pulled it back, it'd work. I'd say, yeah, it helps me now. A lot of good that does me now. It was too late, right? So his timing was good. And what was the source? It was external. In other words, it went from my dad's head to my head. Okay? Fast forward 40 years, and I'm in Boston at a conference on a cold January or February morning, and we have the afternoon off. And I don't know a lot about art, but I knew there was a really great Impressionist section in the Boston Museum. And they were putting together a group of people to go to the museum to look at the Impressionist art at the Boston Museum. So I got in the van and I went along, and we had a guide. And she took us to the Impressionist section, and we got to the Impressionist section, and she said to us, so tell me what you see. How is this picture different from this picture? What do you think about this picture down here? What impressions do you get when you look at this picture? And it was a small group of us, and she said, now stay together and talk about it. And we said, well, it's very colorful. And somebody said, it's not like a photograph. And she said, how? It's not like a photograph. I said, well, the lines aren't clean like a photograph. It's different, okay? And we talked about it. It had a lot of flowers and lots of reds and blues and green. And she told us nothing. She just asked questions, okay? And I learned more about Impressionist art in that 45 minutes to an hour than by anything I'd probably heard about Impressionist art before. She wasn't doing what my dad did, which was appropriate for him at that time, but she was using a different strategy. She was highly skilled. What do you see? What do you notice? Yes, talk about that color. How do these works compare to those in the previous room, which looked more like photographs and so on? Now, what was the type of interaction here? It was sort of a querying, wasn't it? It was questioning. And what else? It was invitational. She wasn't testing us. She said, talk about that. She was inviting us to join the conversation. When was she doing it? In this case, again, during and ongoing. Okay. And what was the source? Well, the source was sort of internal. It came from us. It came from inside. Do you follow what I'm saying? And sometimes we say, well, you know, kids can't read this because they don't have enough inside them. And often they do if we ask the right questions and raise the right issues. I didn't think I knew anything about Impressionist art, and maybe I didn't, but through her skilled question asking, she was able to get us to do that. Now, these are two very different ways of learning. These were both learning experiences, but they were conducted very differently. And I'm going to suggest to you later in the morning that reading comprehension is more like the one to the right side than to the left side. Do you follow what I'm saying? It's all about the kinds of questions we ask, the kind of language we use, the kind of querying we do, and so on. There's a little bit of this off to the left. By the way, in deference to my father, he was very much on this side. He was always saying to me as a involved farm kid, how many bushels of soybeans do you think we have on that truck? Or we're going to need some more fertilizer to finish this field. How many bags do you think? You go up to take the tractor, go up to the barn, get some more bags. How many bags do you think we'll need? And he was always asking me questions about, you know, and when you're coming back from the other farm, stop and take a look at that hay and see whether you think we can do it tomorrow or whether we can do it this afternoon before it rains. He was very much on this side, but on that particular day when we were sawing them, he knew I was in trouble and I needed help. It wouldn't have been right for him to say, well, what do you think we're doing here? You know, he would, you're right. I said, I'm in trouble, help me. So I think we need to think about these things. And I think I had the delightful experience of teaching an undergraduate course this past fall at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland, where I live. And I threw up a couple of these, and I wanted the undergraduates to talk about these things. Because sometimes I don't think we talk enough about learning events. And what caused behavior to change? And what did the teacher do? And what did the teacher not do? Well, let's start the way I usually start. And on your table, I think there's some copy of this. I just made some statements about reading comprehension. There are 5 here. And if you would, I'm going to put you to work. Would you go down that list? And by the way, if you don't have a copy in front of you, just number it 1 to 5. And would you do this alone? Keep your eyes on your own paper for just a few minutes and just indicate whether you agree or disagree. These are not meant to be tricky at all. Would you circle one that you feel really strongly about? Now, I'm going to rush you just a little bit here. So when you finish, you about finished? Have you done it? Would you turn to the person next to you and would you sort of share what you have and talk about it a little bit? Don't be, you're not an inhibited group, just talk about it a little bit. Well, let me interrupt you. Thank you for your conversations. By the way, which ones, let me have your attention. Okay. Which ones are you talking about? Number 4. What's number 4? As many as 20% of middle grade students. Yeah, what'd you put on that one? How many put agree? How many put disagree? Number 4. Let's stay on number 4, okay? How many put agree? How many put disagree? Well, actually, there is a really important study, and I would recommend it to the doctoral students, by Valencia and Bewley. Valencia and Bewley, I think about done in 2004, where they looked at kids who were not passing state assessment. And what they found was that about 20%, actually 24%, were really quite good at comprehension. but weren't fluent enough to be efficient on a state assessment test. Now, what does that suggest? It suggests that you don't have to be fluent, as many people say, in order to comprehend. In order to be efficient, you need to be fluent and constructive. But it's possible to comprehend text and not be very, very fluent. And yet the profession has sort of looked at it the other way. So the point is that we'll try to address all of these during the morning. And in addition to that, these are the kinds of things that I think educators ought to talk about. These are issues that we ought to have conversations about. Okay? I put this PowerPoint together, and my wife, who is a graduate and a PhD of this program, and very smart, always looks at it because she has to clean up my slides a little bit, you know, like tucking in my collar and so on. And she said, I said, what do you think? She said, Doris, I think it's good, but it's too long. And I said, I know it's too long. I'm talking about comprehension, right? And I said, so where can I cut it? And usually she has good ideas. So I woke up one morning and I said, I'm going to cut out a whole section in the early part. She said, oh, no, you can't do that. And then I suggested another section to cut out. And she said, no, you can't cut that out. So the whole thing is still here, and we haven't cut anything out. And this was a part I was going to cut out, sort of looking at some of the past research. But I think it's important for doctoral students particularly to know this. And I was reminded of what happened a few weeks after our book came out, The Comprehension Experience. And we got an email from a recent doctoral graduate at a very prestigious university. She'd just gotten her PhD. And she sent us a text, and she said, I really like your book. And she said, I love chapter 1, which was the theory chapter. She said, I read it twice. And she said, then I wondered, why didn't I learn this in my doctoral program? I just finished a doctorate, and I didn't know about most of these people and what they did. So we're going to look at some of these people. I think if you want to look at comprehension, you got to go back to Edmund Burke Huey, 1908. You know, that's 107 years ago. It's the psychology and pedagogy of reading. He unfortunately died very early. I think he was 43 years of age. He was at what is now, I believe, Penn State University. But at that time, it was pretty radical. And what Huey was talking about was silent reading for comprehension, that the major unit of reading is the phrase, and the importance of sentences. And he really began to tie reading and thinking together. And that is a book that I think is a good book sometime when you have nothing to do, that you can go back and read that book. Then we jump to 1917, still almost 100 years ago. Thorndike, Reading as Reasoning, a classic work, where he talks about how reading and thinking are really connected. And he talks about the over and under potency of words. He said some words are really important and give you a lot of information, and some don't give you much information at all. Remember, 1917. It's a long time ago. And then there's this quote I pulled out. He said, the mind must select, repress, soften, emphasize, organize, all under the right culture of purpose or demand. And that's 1917 talk, but what he was saying is it's a very active process. There's nothing sort of passive about it. And then we're going to jump to 1932, and there were a lot of people in between. Sir Frederick Bartlett, who did a study, and these were adults. He had them read something, and then he said to them, tell me what you read, and they retold the story. And then later he said to them, you remember that story you read last week? Would you tell it to me again? And they retold it. And what he assumed was it would get shorter. And it did. And would people leave out things. But then they started putting things back in that weren't there in the first place. And he said, wait a minute, something's going on here. People were actually building or constructing meaning. For instance, in one story you had kids read, or adults read, it was about a boy who hid from his father, and later on, when people retold it, they said once there was a boy who was very afraid of his father. That wasn't in there, but they had to develop a rationale for it and so on. And now that wasn't accurate with the text, but Bartlett began to talk about construction theory. And I've always had a soft spot for Bartlett, because when he retired, no, actually when he died, one of his former doctoral students said about Bartlett, he had a good career, but nothing of profundity or nothing of really major importance would carry on in his work. It was a good career, but it was not a career that was lasting in any sort of way, okay? We'll see what happens. Then 1944, you recognize this, Frederick Davis. He said, let's break reading comprehension down to a series of skills and so on. He came up with what? 9 skills. Word meaning, or vocabulary, author's purpose, main thought, which is main idea, answers. And by the way, I have this on the handout, but I'll give you the handout a little bit later, so don't feel that you need to copy these and so on. And to some extent, that still exists today, doesn't it? Now, we can sort of break down reading and look at some components, and some that's okay. But a few years ago, actually 2 or 3 decades ago now, there used to be books, Barnell Loft books, where there were main idea books. Remember, Liz? Cause-effect books, sequence books, and so on. And we taught those as separate skills. There weren't any stories. They were just little paragraphs, right? And some of that can be traced back. Maybe Davis is not totally responsible for that, but certainly it goes back. So what has come before, in some ways, dictate what we're doing today. And then we get to Bruner, Jerome Bruner, and I've skipped some people, but this was somebody that Ron Kramer and I studied when we were at the University of Delaware as doctoral students, and a study of thinking. Keep in mind what was happening at that time. We were in a world of behaviorism. As a matter of fact, Dr. Kramer's degree and my degree is a PhD in the behavioral sciences. It wasn't an education degree, it was about behaviorism. And we sort of rejected it. But a quick story, which I don't have time to tell, but I'm going to tell it anyway. Envision Ron Kramer and Dorsey Hammond, 40 years younger. And we're sitting in a seminar. And I am presenting Bruner. And I'm trying to, and this guy that we had just sort of discovered. And I'm trying to tie Bruner into reading comprehension. And the university had enticed a really outstanding, or what they thought outstanding, cognitive psychologist to join the staff. And he came to seminar that night. And he just received his PhD. And he came to seminar, and Stauffer, our mentor, sort of wanted to show off a little bit, so he began to press me really hard about Bruner. And he would ask tough questions, and I thought I was doing okay, because I read Bruner, I knew Bruner. And you didn't show up at a Stauffer seminar without having done the reading several times, actually. And this young PhD graduate turned to Stauffer and said, I don't remember exact, but it was something like, let me work on it a while, or let me work on him a while. I can't remember what it was. But I didn't like it, but I kept my cool. And he started to ask me questions. Well, it wasn't long before I realized that I knew more about Bruner than he did. So I was okay. So I'm dealing with this young prospective faculty member. And all of a sudden, off to my left, this guy said, named Ron Kramer, he said to this guy, if you knew Bruner, you wouldn't have asked that question. And Ron just hit him up the side of the head, you know, and went after him. And while Ron is going after him, I'm reloading. Okay? Have you ever seen a tag team match in wrestling? That's what it was for about 10 minutes. Remember, Ron? And so after the seminar, Stauffer took this guy out to dinner. And he told Dr. Stauffer that he thought maybe he wouldn't come to the University of Delaware after all. So I go into the office the next morning, and the secretary says, Dorsey, Dr. Stauffer wants to see you immediately. And I knew what was going on, and I walk in, and Ron is sitting there. And he had a very large room and a large desk, and Ron's sitting in front of the desk, and I sit down alongside of Ron. Keep in mind, we're in our late 20s, early 30s, and he looked at us, and he said, if you two guys ever pull a stunt like that again, you'll never get a doctorate at this university. And so we were like two kids who'd been called into the principal's office. But we did him a favor, actually. And I think he actually was sort of proud of us. But, you know, Ron was that way. If somebody was pressing, he's still that way, I know. He will take, and so he had my back. He's always had my back. So Bruner. And what Bruner was saying is, let's look what's going on inside the head. The behaviors were more interested in what was going on outside the head. They said, let's look what's going on inside the head. And then Jean Piaget, a lot of his work was being translated in the 1960s, and we think about the stages, sensory motor, preoperational, and so on. But what I think is really important about Piaget is the assimilation combination theory. In other words, we take in information, and then our mind accommodates to it, and it changes us. In other words, it's not like when you get a new idea, it's like a sheet of paper, you just put it on the existing file. No, the file gets rearranged. And that assimilation accommodation thing, again, suggesting what? A very active process. And then the concept of disequilibration. That you're in a state where you're just not sure and you're curious about something. You ever had an experience where you can't remember somebody's name, and you know their name, and you can't think of their name, and you're just trying to think, who is that? I know that person, and so on. And you're not satisfied. You're disequilibrated and you say, oh, yeah, now I know. So there's that concept. And then along came a guy. He was working, we discovered a little bit later, once we got to Oakland, by the name of Dick Anderson, and who was his director of the study of the Center of Reading. By the way, Anderson studied at Harvard. Where do you think Bruner was? At Harvard, okay? And in our first doctoral class here at Oakland University, 1979, we had 3 students. And we used a textbook by Dick Anderson, Rand Spiro, and Montague entitled Schooling and the Acquisition of Knowledge. That was the textbook we used. So we had very much embraced this constructivist view of reading. And then in 1976, the Center for the Study of Reading was established at the University of Illinois. And they gathered together some of the brightest cognitive psychologists, linguists, literacy theorists in the country, actually in the Western-speaking world. It was directed by Richard Anderson, who was a true gentleman and a scholar, and a particularly honest man and very bright. Remember, he'd been at Harvard with Bruner and so on. And they rediscovered Bartlett. They said, holy cow, this guy back in 1932 knew what he was talking about. And they started to talk about constructivism. And during that time, and by the way, Bob Swartz on the faculty here was there at that time. So we have nice connections and bloodlines back to that group and so on. They produced over 15 years, 600 technical reports. And they always came in a yellow binder, and they were really exciting. And I asked David Pierce not too long ago if there was any place where all 600 of these reports were together. And he said, I think probably there are, but I'll talk to Dick about it. And I never got back to him, but they exist somewhere. The emphasis was on cognitive processing, on prior knowledge, and its impact on new learning. Pearson described it as a gloriously invigorating time. It was the best time, I think, for reading comprehension, and they popularized the concept of schema. That's where the term schema, it was out there before. Piaget had used it, but they popularized it in the schema. And we went around Michigan talking about schema activation, schema. And they also popularized the term metacognition. And metacognition really got to be on the front burner during the 1970s and early 80s and so on. There were a number of studies. I'm going to go through them very quickly. Anderson and Vickert, the home buyer burglar study, where they have kids read a story, and some kids read it from a point of view, some students read it from the point of view of a home buyer, some read it from the point of view of a burglar, and then they ask them what they read, and the people who read it from the point of view of a burglar tend to focus on things like the house unlocked on Thursday, very secluded. The burglar people, the home buyer people, focus on the 2 or 3 acres, new roof, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you could give that same article in Rochester to a real estate agent and to a policeman, both graduates of Oakland University, and say, read it. And then say, tell me what you read. And they would tell you a lot of the same things, but they would tell you different things because their culture is different, their perspective is different, and so on. So it's a very, very dynamic process. And then the other study we'll look at in just a minute, Anderson, Reynolds, and so on, where it used to be called Rocky the Wrestler, but I changed it to Brian the Wrestler. And they had some people read it as a prison article. Brian got up from the mat slowly, planning his escape. He hesitated a moment and thought things were not going well. What bothered him most was being held against his will. The charge against him had been weak. He considered his present situation. The lock against him was strong, but he thought he could break it, and so on. And some people read it from the point of view of a prisoner. Some people read it from the point of view of a wrestler, and they came up with different interpretations, so it was purposely ambiguous. And then some people had no title to deal with, and some of those people said it was a wrestling article, and other people said it was a prison article. And then they took a group of fine arts majors at the University of Illinois, and they said, we want you to do an experiment with us. And they took them to the gym at the University of Illinois. And then most of those fine arts people interpreted it as a wrestling article. Even you change the location, geographical location, you may get interpretation. So this is just a very dynamic, fluid kind of thing. Let me go back here. That's the ambiguous text. A couple different pieces of research that I really like, which were not CSR. By the way, there's 600 of these plus. Okay, now, I've not read them all, but this is a study where they showed people a video of a car accident. And with one group, they said to them, how fast was the car going when they bumped? The car's going when they bumped. And another group said, how fast were cars going when they collided? And the third group were asked, how fast was the car going when they smashed? And then they asked them, the first group came up with 30, 35 miles an hour, and the second group came up with 45 or 50 miles an hour, and the third group came up with 60, simply by changing one word. You get a different interpretation. And then I like the sort of the afterthought here. They said to them, by the way, did you notice any glass, broken glass on the highway? Well, the bump people didn't notice any glass, but the smash people said, oh yeah, I saw glass. There was no glass, okay? But they had constructed that based upon, so, there's sort of a downside to that, but there's also a very exciting side to that, and so on. The other study that I really like is Gick and Holyoke, and I didn't discover this study until about 10 years ago, and Dr. McEnany is shaking his head, where they gave students a story or a scene where a general is trying to attack a fort. And there's several approaches into that fort, but none of the roads will support a massive movement of troops. So what they decided to do is they were going to attack the fort with lighter armament from several different directions, and they were going to coordinate on that fort at the same time from several different directions, okay? Later on, they gave them a situation where a person had a tumor, and it was inoperable, but they could use a laser, but the only problem, the laser was so strong that it would destroy too many cells going through the body to this particular tumor. And they said to the students, so how might you solve this problem? You're a medical doctor. And they sort of were aghast. They didn't know. And then this teacher said, think about the fort problem. And they said, oh yeah, we'll use lighter lasers and coming from different directions, and we'll concentrate on that tumor at the same time, and so on. And I think that's a really important study. And the reason I do is that many times kids don't know, but what we have to do with them is say, okay, you do know about this over here. And how can you use what you know over here to think about this? That transfer, I think, is really, really important. Does that make sense to you? Well, and then Sue mentioned the Durkin study. 1979, came out in the Reading Research Quarterly. She used 4th and 5th grade because she figured by that time the phonics and the word recognition was over and the kids were reading for comprehension. Durkin was an interesting person. She observed teachers in mid-central Illinois for 4,500 minutes, which is a total of 75 hours if you do the math. And she came up with a major finding, which was absolutely shocking. 1% of the time was used in instruction in comprehension. Now, there was a lot of time used in assessing comprehension. I think it was about 17%, but very little in actually. And we went around saying, "My God, we're not teaching it," And I remember being in Lansing or Jackson or somewhere, and Rob Tierney was there. Some of you know Rob Tierney, know his work, a very fine scholar, and worked with Pearson. And he said to me, "Dorsey, this is devastating." That we thought we were teaching comprehension, but we weren't. We were assessing it. And always the question, how do we teach it? And then along came a little book, and I didn't bring it with me, Becoming a Nation of Readers. I'm sure it's on the shelves of many of the faculty members here, right, Liz? Where they talk about reading as having 5 characteristics. Skilled readers are constructive. In other words, they use what's in their head and interact with the text to reveal or construct that meaning. They're fluent. They're fairly efficient. They read at a reasonable rate. Now let's talk about that for a minute. When I go into a district, this is a framework that I use. I look at the students and I say, how many are constructive, how many are fluent, and so on. And I can tell teachers before I've been in their classrooms what they have in their school. And I say, now you have in your classroom a number of kids who are fluent but not constructive. Do you know what I'm talking about? They sound great. And when they finish, you say to them, tell me what you read. And they say, I don't know, didn't know I had to think about it, Mr. Hammond. I just thought I had to read it, you know. And then you have those children that are just on the opposite end, that are just hellish to listen to. They grunt and spit and cough, and you think, Lord, will they ever get done? And they get done, and you say, so Sam, what was that about? And he said, well, this is about, and the kid just nails it. See, they're constructive, but they're not fluent. So what do we have in American schools? In Bloomfield Hills, in Detroit, in Farmington, and so on, we have a lot of kids who are both constructive and fluent. We have some kids who are fluent but not constructive. We have other kids who are constructive but not fluent. And we have some kids who are both and some kids who are neither, okay? So it's a very nice interaction. By the way, I think there's a lot of research yet to be done here. We know how fluency can help comprehension, but we've not looked seriously enough at how comprehension affects fluency. And there's some nice dissertations there, by the way, if that's a hint for any of you. Strategic, that's the metacognitive piece. They know what to do when meaning breaks down. They know what to do. Maybe they can't always do it, but they have some strategies. And Anne Brown, who was also with the center, found that metacognitive strength and reading competency is highly correlated. Those kids who are good readers know what they're doing, they know about the process, they know what to do when they get in trouble, and so on. They're motivated. They can read for a very long time. That wonderful situation when a child is reading a book that Linda Pavinetti has recommended, and you say to the child, Liz, and Liz is just so engrossed in that book and you want to see that, you say. Or the child who will leave his Xbox and pick up a book and start to read as an alternative, and so on. Lifelong. So if you take a sort of a comprehension view, you see that reading is a lifelong process. I think I'm still learning how to read, really. I remember I was teaching a course here, 331. That sound familiar? Here at Oakland University in the late 90s, and after I finished the course, Erica Kohler came up to me. I remember she was a delightful student. She said, Dr. Hammond, you know what? And I said, what? She said, I thought you learned to read and then it was over. And I said, Erica, it's never over. Okay, so we can look at these factors and really sort of define what it means to be skilled readers and how well are we addressing these things. Just an example I used to use here at Oakland about construction theory. It's very simple and silly, actually, but Mary was hungry for ice cream. She saw the truck coming down the street. She rushed inside to get her purse. Now, what kind of truck is that? Ice cream truck. Why is Mary rushing inside? To get money to? Buy some ice cream. Yeah, can you see that truck in your mind's eye?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, what color is it?
Mine is yellow.
Yours is yellow, Gwen, okay. Do you hear anything?
Yes.
Bells and songs? That's construction theory, you see. We're filling in the gaps with the mind, and so on. Michigan definition of reading. Now keep in mind the 1970s and 80s. As Joan says to me, the wind was at your back. You know, it was a wonderful time. Reading is a process of constructing meaning through the dynamic interaction among the reader's existing knowledge, the information suggested by the written text, and the context of the reading situation. People like Charlie Peters and Karen Wixon and other people really worked on this, and I think it's the best definition. And I like it, my bias is because it starts with construction theory. And the information is suggested by the text. So on. And I think we still use that definition here, don't we? It's lasted 30 years, okay?